If you've never tried this, I guarantee you, give it a shot. You'll love it. It tastes and feels exactly like the creamy, consistency and texture of a real, dairy ice cream. Hey everybody, welcome back to Conscientious Omnivore. My name is Powell. Today is another video about Februdairy, which is basically a marketing ploy by the dairy industry to try to get people to consume more dairy products, drink more milk, etc. And I've already done one video about this effort, and I talked to you about the ethical implications of drinking milk and consuming dairy products. And today I'm going to do a similar video, but this time I'm going to tackle the health aspects and what are kind of the health implications of consuming dairy products. I think there's a lot of good information here. I'm going to have cited references, and you can go check out more information on everything I do show you. And I'm also going to show you how you can make your own ice cream that you just saw in the intro. It's super easy and really just can't be beat. So I will show that to you afterward. And yeah, let's get into the the information about your health. First topic at hand is saturated fat and cholesterol. These are really important points, and I've covered this before in the presentation I did on the general health benefits of adopting a vegan diet, whole food plant-based vegan diet. So definitely check that out if you haven't seen that video. I'll link it at the end. So this slide is from that presentation. I definitely recommend people to check out the whole thing. Basically, the first point I have on here is what a lot of people now are, claiming on all sorts of social media and different, forums, that basically there's no connection, there's no statistically significant link between dietary cholesterol and saturated fat intake and your blood serum cholesterol level. And, the thing is that this is true, but it's true because of the genetic differences found in people. And, what this means is that if you look at what are called cross-sectional observational studies, you can't see a correlation. All that means is that if you have person A and person B, they can be eating the same amounts of dietary, fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol, but they might have very different levels of blood serum cholesterol. And so when you look across a whole bunch of people, you won't see any kind of correlation between the amount of their intake versus what their blood serum levels are showing. And this is not a proper way to study it, because as the second point here shows, the relationship between saturated fat intake and cholesterol levels is so consistent that there's actually an equation that can almost perfectly map out predictive cholesterol levels for saturated fat intake levels. And this is obviously up to a point, because once you've saturated your body's ability to absorb it, your blood serum cholesterol levels won't go up beyond that point. But up to a certain range, it's pretty much perfectly predicted by this equation. And what is also interesting about this is that as the point here says, both of these relationships have been known for quite some time, and we're talking several decades. Some of these are approaching 50 years now, or actually over 50 years. They have known this, and they've been able to demonstrate this in hundreds and hundreds of randomized clinical trials and controlled interventional experiments. What that means is that they took people and they put them into a lab environment and controlled what they ate and drank, and then they could measure the the levels of cholesterol in their blood. And again, what this means is that if you take somebody and you reduce the amount of saturated fat in their diet, you can actually decrease their cholesterol levels. If you increase it, you can increase it. But because they have known these for so long, somebody who's ill-intentioned, perhaps somebody working in the animal agriculture industry who's trying to convince you that saturated fat and cholesterol intake don't matter, what they can do is purposely game studies, and I use that term loosely because what they do is really just use this as a propaganda thing, to basically keep funding studies that are either cross-sectional observational studies, where they know that there's going to be no statistically significant link shown, and they'll just do this over and over again, despite the fact that it's been known and demonstrated for decades, over hundreds and hundreds of trials, that this is the case. But they'll keep doing this and release it as a new study. Or sometimes what they'll do is they'll also look at a combination, like a collection of different studies, and then they'll release that as a new study, a meta-analysis of all the previous studies. And what they're doing here is purposely sowing doubt in the mind of the consumer. So people that don't know this, you see another one of these studies appear that like, oh, there's no link, and now there's doubt. People are thinking, well, one guy told me it's bad, the other person told me it's not. And I've talked about this in previous videos too. When you get this kind of like, one person says this, one person says that, the average person will just throw up their hands and say, well, nobody knows. You have one PhD saying this, one PhD saying the opposite. Who knows? And this is exactly what the cigarette industry did, with lung cancer. They showed all sorts of, statistical correlation and all this kind of stuff. Again, there's lots of other tricks. Check out some of the links that I provided here. You'll see some of the other ones that they use. But, it goes into the details. I'd encourage everybody to learn about this so that you understand the mechanism behind how heart disease is, caused by elevated blood serum cholesterol levels, and everything else is basically contributory at best. So it is the sole cause of heart disease, and, heart disease is the #1 killer in the world, kills more people than all other, causes. So yeah, definitely look into that, check it out. Okay, next thing I want to cover is osteoporosis. Now, everybody says, oh, I need to drink lots of milk or consume yogurt or dairy or whatever, cheese, because I want strong bones. That's what you're told, and, that's what everybody is led to believe. But when you look, there are an increasing number of studies showing that there is no protective effect of consuming lots of dairy. And in fact, there's lots of evidence to suggest the opposite. So if you look at this study, it's over 106,000 people. They followed them for 20 years. It actually showed an increased rate of death for both men and women. Most of that is related to heart disease, as I mentioned, because of the saturated fat and cholesterol. Dairy is very high in both. And what it actually showed was that there was an increased rate of hip fractures for women. The men didn't have any change whatsoever, so it was neither protective nor damaging, but for the women, it actually caused more hip fracture rates, which is a good indication of osteoporosis. Here's an interesting statistic from this study that for the women, the rate of death for those drinking 3 or more glasses of milk was almost twice as high as those drinking only 1 glass. So even again here, you can see that, the more of it you consume, the more likely you are to probably succumb to heart disease. Again, that is the leading number one leading cause of death worldwide. So for men, as I mentioned, the hip fracture rate was unchanged, but for both sexes, the rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and biomarkers of oxidative stress and inflammation were all higher with the increased milk consumption. And one thing that people who actually go and follow through the link here, what you'll see is that the consumption of fermented dairy products did seem to offer some protection against the fractures, but it did still correlate positively with the oxidative stress and inflammation. So despite protecting your bones somewhat, it did still cause oxidative stress and inflammation, which is again kind of markers of ill health and heart disease and what have you. I also want to cover a little bit about type 1 diabetes and Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. These are all kind of associated with milk consumption as well. So there is again some evidence that type 1 diabetes is caused by the early exposure to dairy products in basically childhood, but again very early exposure. So babies who are not breastfed, for example, and get milk replacement formulas and things like that, they do seem to be more likely to get type 1 diabetes. This point here is very interesting. There are obviously lots of various illnesses and diseases that the cows themselves get, and one of those is a form of tuberculosis. I think it's also abbreviated as MAP. But this basically is found in almost all dairy cows in the U.S. I found a statistic that showed it's 68% of all dairy herds are infected with this form of tuberculosis. Of the largest dairies, 95% of them are infected. So as I've talked before in my previous videos, more and more the small scale farmer is going out of business and being replaced by these huge factory farmed companies and dairies and what have you. And obviously the larger these companies are, the more likely they are to be profit driven, motivated to cram as many animals as possible into small confined areas. And what happens is that any disease that is there in the herd, it's going to get spread, or it's more likely to be spread. So I think that's a really, really scary thought that over 2/3 of the dairy cows in the U.S. Have this form of tuberculosis, and it's linked with the type 1 diabetes, and also the same infection is now, with the most recent research that I've seen, linked to Crohn's disease as well as rheumatoid arthritis. So these are really debilitating, very serious conditions, and they're associated with this infection that can be found in 2/3 of the dairy in the U.S. And the last point here is that this virus has actually been shown to survive pasteurization. So even though if you're not drinking raw milk or consuming raw cheese products, you could still be being exposed to this virus. Next topic is cancer. In the U.S., prostate and breast cancers are the most common for men and women, respectively. And there is information now that a different virus, it's called bovine leukemia virus, is actually attributable to be the cause of 37% of all breast cancer cases. Now, that's a huge number. So over 1/3 of the breast cancer cases in the U.S. can be attributable to this bovine leukemia virus. That is an insane figure. Like, I mean, try to wrap your head around that. If you know anybody who has, succumbed or even just been, suffered, diagnosed with, maybe treated and maybe survived breast cancer, think of that. That is ridiculous. The leukemia virus itself is transmitted via blood. It's a bloodborne infection. And, you might be thinking like, well, how are these, cows infecting each other? And the fact is that most of the transmission is supposed to be happening through the various tools and instruments that are used to basically, mutilate the cows in various ways. So cows are regularly dehorned. What that means is that the horns that would grow out of their heads get cut off when they're very small babies, when they're little calves, and they don't basically sterilize or use different tools when working from one cow to the next. So unless they're burning them out, which sometimes they burn them out, you can get infection from one cow to the next. That's one form of possible infection route. Another method that it could be transmitted is during the artificial insemination process. A farmer will actually push their hand up almost to their shoulder, basically into the anus of the cow, and then they will artificially inseminate them with the other hand. And what happens is sometimes there's bleeding, there's rectal bleeding from the cow when this is done, and then they go from one cow to the next, to the next, to the next. And I mean, look up the videos online, you'll see that it's like they're just going factory style from one cow to the next. You can just imagine how easy it is for any kind of viruses or illnesses to be transmitted that way. The other form of transmission is often basically, I didn't know this was actually shocking to me, that cows' udders are often basically I don't know, I can't even, it almost sounds ridiculous just to say it, but they will actually literally cut off like extra nipples that the cow may have. So they don't want more than like 4. I think this is again going back to the industrialization and just treating these poor sentient creatures as machines or products. That's how many of those little milking connections they have, the little suction things, and if they have extra nipples, they just cut them off. So they will literally do that, and again, the scissors, if they're not sterilized, you can easily infect one cow to the next. So these are pretty horrific things that tie in again to the ethics in the other video that I mentioned. It's just a really abhorrent practice, and yeah, that's pretty terrible. But Next point here is that dairy consumption raises estrogen and IGF-1 levels in humans. IGF-1 is an insulin-like growth factor 1, and that is positively associated with cancer cell growth. The same thing with elevated estrogen levels, and both of these are shown to happen in humans when you consume dairy. So again, just a really bad combination. Okay, next thing is Parkinson's disease. For anybody who doesn't know, that does affect quite a number of people. I couldn't find worldwide statistics, but in the US alone, it accounts for about 30,000 deaths each year, and it affects 10 million people globally. That's what I was able to find on it. It's a debilitating disease, very serious. People get tremors and all sorts of issues associated with it. So what has been shown is that diets high in animal fat or cholesterol are associated with a substantial increase in risk for Parkinson's. Milk consumption is actually very strongly implicated, and there are many different theories as to why, but one of them is linking it possibly to the high pesticide content. They just basically have different theories, and this is one of the leading ones. The American Cancer Society also has found that you're almost twice as likely to get Parkinson's disease if you're in the highest consumer level of milk. So basically, if you're consuming a lot of milk, you have almost double the chance of getting Parkinson's disease. And one thing that I want to point out here is that bioaccumulation basically means that when you have an animal eating all of the kind of contaminants that it gets through its feed or water or anything like that from its environment, if you then eat that animal, you're getting the accumulated level of all of those toxins and kind of like dangerous levels of chemicals and pesticides and herbicides and everything that animal has consumed. And when you eat animals, you're actually able to consume a lot more pesticides and chemicals than you would if you just ate the same amount of plants directly, because that amount of plant material would have kept you alive for a lot longer. So this is actually a really great response to anybody who's trying to say like, oh, you shouldn't be a vegan because then you're going to be exposed to more pesticides. The truth is you're going to actually be exposed to far less because you're eating the plants directly and you're not getting that bioaccumulation coming through from eating the animals. This study that I linked here at the end shows that around 95% of the persistent organic pollutants found in people's diets comes directly from animal fats like fatty fish, meat, and dairy products. So again, bear that in mind when you are consuming dairy. Most dairy does have very high levels of fat and saturated fat, so saturated fat and cholesterol, and you are getting a double whammy because not only are you getting the cardiovascular damage, you are also getting the pesticides and chemicals. So I just want to end on some typical excuses. People will say, but I'm pregnant, or I'm concerned for my kid, I'm concerned for my babies, I'm breastfeeding. There's a whole bunch of things that people will say when they don't want to basically look into a vegan diet. And what I want to offer here is the quote. I'm just going to read the whole thing. It is the position of the American Dietetic Association that appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. Well-planned vegetarian diets are appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, and adolescence, and for athletes. And there is a British equivalent of this association, and they roughly say the same thing. But the other thing to note here is that this is the United States' largest organization of food and nutrition professionals. There's over 100,000 credentialed practitioners, and that is their official stance. So if anybody gives you these excuses, feel free to point them to this statement. Okay, so I've covered that. And now I want to get into a little bit of a different, bend to kind of show you some of the other things that you'll often see when you get people who try to refute this type of information. Here I just found a random website. It's called Healthline.com. I don't know who runs this. I have no idea. I just basically looked online for some things about osteoporosis and dairy, and this was one of the first links that came up. And basically it's asking the question, is dairy good for your bones? And the article, without boring you to death, basically is telling you, yeah, it's great for your health and for osteoporosis and bone health, and you should keep consuming dairy. And he makes all this guy, I don't know him from anybody, but Chris Gunners, he makes this claim that that basically a lot of the studies that show that dairy is not protective, or that quite the opposite, that it actually harms your bone health, that these are all poorly designed studies and this, that, and the other. He doesn't really give examples as to why they're not good, but what he basically just says is that they're correlative and not scientific. They're not scientifically as rigorous as the ones that are basically like a double-blind controlled study, et cetera, et cetera. And then the interesting thing is that I've got here where he basically says real science disagrees, and basically tells you what the gold standard is for science, and all this kind of stuff. So he says one group receives an intervention and the other group is the control group, and they just keep eating normally. And then he gives you studies linked for childhood, adulthood, elderly people, etc. And it sounds really scientific, and it looks really good. And then he's basically just saying it is best to get your calcium from dairy or other foods that contain calcium. And he literally says most of them lead to the same conclusion: dairy works. This is what he's saying. But then you go and open up some of these studies, and while he's claiming that dairy works, look at the actual studies. It just shows that it's not dairy, it's calcium supplementation that works. So they're actually the studies that I looked and have one here. Let's see which one. Yeah, high calcium intakes, mean calcium intakes. It doesn't mention anything about dairy. This is one of them. Here's another one. Calcium supplementation. They were basically, again, given calcium pills. It has nothing to do with dairy. It also, again, doesn't mention anything about heart health or impact to cholesterol or anything else. Here's another one. Here they're giving estrogen and calcium. And again, there is no mention. Here it is, elemental calcium. There's no mention of dairy intake. But in the article, he's saying that dairy works. So this is, again, totally misleading and doesn't really address. So the studies that he's linking don't prove the point that he's trying to make. Very poorly done. Now, here's another thing that's really interesting. This one is done by the Harvard Health, medical school here, Harvard Medical School. They're talking about how much calcium do you need. They're talking about different recommendations. The World Health Organization has a much lower recommendation of about 500 milligrams. They talk about this, and how in the U.S. they are basically telling people about 1,000, so it's double that. And basically, scaring and fear-mongering people into drinking tons of dairy. If you look at the recommendation, they tell people to consume 3 servings of dairy a day. And here again, they talk about the studies don't show that this has helped. So what they say is that calcium and vitamin D supplements don't prevent fractures. And again, this is coming from the Harvard page telling you this. And it also says high calcium intake either from food or pills doesn't help reduce fracture risk. Then they go and give you a chart, which I'm going to get back to, which shows you the various levels of calcium found in these different kinds of foods. But before we get to that, I just want to show you this, the downside of calcium supplements. They also went into this and said that you have an increased risk of kidney stones, and you have an increased risk of heart attack. So again, these are pretty, severe, important side effects. And what is their ultimate recommendation? That they don't. They say, what's the bottom line? They don't recommend you going crazy and getting the 1,000 milligrams. They say, 500 to 700 is plenty. Excuse me. And what they're saying, which I just think is really funny, and I'll show you why in a second. They say you can easily, or it says you can probably get most or all of your calcium from food, especially if you have a serving or 2 of dairy products daily. If you can't tolerate dairy, which, as I've mentioned in my video on ethics, most people are lactose intolerant. So, this is kind of a funny statement. And then they say, if you can't tolerate dairy, you should still be able to get 300 milligrams a day in your diet and can take a low-dose supplement. And then, they're still recommending get about 500. But now look at this chart. The highest levels for anything in their chart, what's the first thing on there? Collard greens. Boom, 360 milligrams, one serving. Excuse me. Next thing, broccoli, kale, soybeans, bok choy, figs, broccoli, again, oranges. Oranges have calcium. Most people probably have no clue. I didn't realize they had this much. But anyway, I mean, I eat a couple of oranges a day, boom, I'm already over 110. So, you know, again, lots of great sources in the plant, kingdom. And you look at like the next best thing, they have sardines canned with bones. That's the thing that comes close to the collard greens, and even that is, you know, less than that. So, you know, again, do people really want to be eating bones? I mean, come on, it's like I'd much rather have the greens, which are also going to have tons of phytonutrients and minerals that are really beneficial to your health, and no cholesterol and no saturated fat. You know, again, they list a few things: shrimp, salmon, again with the bones. And even that is like, you know, half of what you're getting from the collard greens. And then of course they go into dairy, and, you know, they do list that, you know, most dairy does have, you know, fairly high levels of calcium. But, shoot down here to the bottom of the list, you see fortified foods, almond milk, rice milk, soy milk, etc. Boom, 300. It's like on par or better than most of the dairy products listed. If you're eating tofu, you know, 4 ounces of tofu is a really small serving. That's fine. You get 205 milligrams right there. Again, you can get fortified orange juice, you can get fortified cereals. There's all sorts of different options, and none of this, you know, should be used as any kind of thing that you have to have the fortified foods in order to, you know, get your requirements. But I know a lot of people will counter the vegan argument by saying, well, I don't want to take supplements, I don't want to take whatever. Well, what do you think you're getting your vitamin D from when you get it from dairy? It's not in there naturally. It's being put in there as an unnatural process to basically boost people's vitamin D levels. So again, you know, your best source of vitamin D is to go outside in the sun. Obviously, if you live in a northern latitude where you don't get sun during the winter, that could be a problem. But again, you know, why wouldn't you just get your fortified plant milk with vitamin D, and then you don't get any of the saturated fat or the cholesterol and the other, you know, problems associated with the viruses and different illnesses that I mentioned. So I just wanted to share that. Here's another thing that I think is very interesting. You go to the USDA's Choose MyPlate website. This is basically, again, the United States Department of Agriculture. They make recommendations to the U.S. Population, telling them what they think is good and healthy to eat. And what do they talk about? Nutrients and health benefits of dairy, calcium, used for building bones, maintaining bone mass, blah, blah, blah. They're telling you to eat 3 cups or the equivalent of dairy products per day. May improve bone mass. Well, all the studies that that are not funded by the dairy industry seem to point the other direction, that it's actually harmful to your bone health. They're telling you about potassium being, high in dairy products. Well, potassium is way more available in plants. Vitamin D, again, it's artificially added to the milk. You could just as easily add it to something else. And they even say soy milk beverages are fortified. So you don't need the dairy for the vitamin D. Then they're basically telling you use the low fat or fat-free forms, and then they warn you about saturated fat, being bad for you and raising your cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's just this kind of like misleading, message. That on the one hand, they're telling you, oh, it's great, it's going to help your bones and all this kind of stuff, but then they're warning you too, like, that it's going to give you heart disease if you don't eat the fat-free versions. So again, if you have something that is health promoting versus something that's got some good aspects, so the calcium, but then has things that are detrimental to your health, why would you not just go with the plant-based option, which is going to be good for your health? It's just crazy. The last thing I really want to cover here, and I realize this video is getting really long, but I think this is very important. So many people will try to tell you that this is all BS that I'm telling you. I encourage everybody, go through the links, look at these things, understand the mechanisms of how these things impact your health and how they work, and then look at how these studies done by the dairy industry and animal agriculture industries in general, look at how they are manipulating the kind of like basic things, usually around the saturated fat, heart disease kind of risk. That's usually where they kind of play around. But here's a typical example. This article came out. I remember I'd already been vegan when I remember reading this article, and I got into several arguments and debates with people I knew, because they would send me things like this, telling me how it's ridiculous, about my vegan diet and what have you. And you read these kind of articles, 5 reasons to start eating full-fat dairy, according to science. They give you all sorts of information about how it's good for your health because of this, that, and the other, and they give you, links to studies. And I remember this one because I remember arguing with somebody about this, and I wanted to show you guys how misleading the one in particular about cholesterol was. And there's an interesting thing here. It says, so cheese can be part of a heart-healthy diet. Research published this year in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that the consumption of full-fat cheese raises healthy HDL cholesterol levels, which are associated with a decreased risk of heart disease, better than does consumption of low-fat varieties. When I remember seeing this, and I went through the study, and I pretty much could debunk it just from the abstract because it was so poorly designed, didn't have baseline measurements, didn't tell you what happened to the LDL readings for the participants. They didn't have a whole bunch of other things that you could just tell it was one of these propaganda fluff pieces. And what they will often do is, like I said, they'll either not take baseline measurements, or they'll look across the people instead of comparing each person to their own readings. Or sometimes they'll do what this article is suggesting, where they'll show that the HDL levels of the person went up, but they won't tell you that the LDL levels also went up, and by a bigger percentage. So the overall net impact to the person's health is still a negative one, but they won't tell you that, and they'll just focus on the one positive aspect, which is the HDL going up. But if you try to go and open this link, boom, page not found. I'm thinking, geez, what happened? I wonder if the study isn't there anymore. I went and I found this article, which you can find on tons and tons of different news sites, because everybody was printing this galore and being happy that go eat your full fat cheese and milk and everything else. I went and found it on another page. Now this page here, they were talking about, well, the jury's out, and there were complaints about this study and all this kind of stuff. And, here it is. Alarm bells usually start ringing when you realize the study on the benefits of cheese has received a significant amount of its funding from dairy manufacturers. Add this to a relatively small study group and a focus on short-term effects and outcomes, and this study certainly doesn't tell us enough for us to start suggesting people eat more cheese. Now, this is what the, what this health site gave, and when you go to this link, again, it's the same thing. Boom, the page is not found. You can go and look for this study. It's not there anymore. I'm convinced that it probably got pulled because who knows, maybe there were enough complaints from other peers reviewing the journal entry. That's my theory anyway. I can't really prove this, but I'm just it's my theory of what happened. And this is actually, I think, very typical of kind of what happens. You can get this industry funded study that is total crap, and anyone with any kind of scientific background or critical thinking skills can look at it and see all the problems in it. But it kind of doesn't matter, because what happens is you get all these websites that are just going to go on here. This is health.us news. I don't know what this website is, but anyway, you get these sites, and you get your Men's Health, and you get all these other online publications that will tell you, hey man, good news, you can go eat all the dairy you want, all the full fat cheese you want, and it's good for your health, and it's good for your heart, and all this kind of stuff. Later on, once these studies are pulled and they're not even there anymore, this article's still going to be up there. People are still going to read this. People are still going to find this. And nobody bothers to go and read the studies. And even if the studies aren't there, a lot of times people will put up studies like that. Put up articles like that and not even link the studies. And they'll just paraphrase what happens in the studies. And I kid you not, get into the habit of reading some of these, and you will sometimes see that even the summary of the study doesn't even match what the article will write about it. People will literally just, tell you one thing, and they'll send you the link, and when you go and look at the link, it doesn't even match. It doesn't even tell you what the person is claiming that the study shows. So, yeah, I just wanted to kind of show some of these examples and get you in the mindset of checking these and looking for these. And once you know the way these things work, you can just spot them from a mile away. And people just want to hear bad news, about their good news about their bad habits. If somebody's telling you eat all the butter you want and it's good for your health, people love hearing that. People want to be told that bacon's good for them, even though it's a class 1 carcinogen. So, anyway, I think that's a pretty good summary here. Let's get into the recipe for making the ice cream. Alright, so believe it or not, to make the nice cream, you really just need one ingredient. It is bananas. Super simple. You take however many ripe bananas you got, and you basically just chop them up into little circles, you put them into a Tupperware, and you freeze them overnight. I'm going to show them to you in a second. Okay, so I've got them sliced up into these little rings. The reason being for that is that I don't have one of these like super high powered blenders, and if you don't chop them up when they've really become like frozen solid, which is usually maybe 8 hours in the freezer, my blender will just simply not do the job. So basically, I just recommend cutting them into these little, maybe like finger thick or smaller slices. Now we're just going to close this up, throw it in the freezer, and let it go overnight. Alright guys, so the bananas are completely frozen now. They've been in overnight. You can tell that they're just frozen solid, which is great. That's what we want. Got our blender ready, and we're going to make 3 different flavored ice creams. One, we're going to just go with plain banana. We're going to add some vanilla, so that'll be like your plain basic vanilla ice cream. Then we're going to do a berry ice cream, which is some frozen berries. This is a mix of whatever's on here. I don't know, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, looks like some currants, and I don't know, whatever else, some cherries. So we're going to do one of those. And then we are going to do a little bit with cocoa powder. And to sweeten it, we are going to make use of these dates. So I've just got these soaking in hot water right now because they're super dry and they won't blend well unless you've got them soaked a little bit. So let's get these in here, blend the whole thing together, and then I'm just going to take 3 equal portions. And the vanilla one, obviously we can just stir in the vanilla. With the fruit one, I'm going to blend it back there, and then the same thing with the third batch. So let's get to work. I just want to show a little bit of the process itself. I can't show you while I'm blending it, but what you end up if you don't have a really powerful blender is you need a lot of patience. So what you do is you just kind of give it a little kick. It immediately pretty much will grind up some of the bananas, and then it'll be kind of like running, just in air because the bananas are going to get thrown up to the top, and it'll just be spinning on empty. So what you want to do is just pretty much just use the the reverse function a little bit and just kind of blend it like little short bursts, the pulse function or whatever it's called. And then you just want to get your spoon out, push all the things back down, and then do it again. And you just got to do this a bunch of times. Eventually this will just start getting into like a creamy mass, and it will actually start blending. So I just wanted to show that because it's not like you just turn it on and boom, it's done a minute later. You got to have some patience and keep working it back down so the banana mixture just kind of stays on or near the blades. Alright, so there it is. After a couple minutes and a little bit of patience, you have pretty much ice cream. And if you've never tried this, I guarantee you, give it a shot, you'll love it. It tastes and feels exactly like the creamy, consistency and texture of a real, dairy ice cream. It's got amazing flavor, it's perfectly sweet. I've never met anybody who hasn't been kind of astounded by the taste and flavor of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this out into about 3 sections. I'm going to leave 1/3 in here, and we're going to add some berries, and then we'll do the chocolate one last. So there we go. We got some berries in there. Let's blend this up, and got the other 2 in the bowls here. So yeah, let's get this blended. Boom. Done. So this one's looking really great too. Let's work on the chocolate one next. Okay, so I threw the other ones back in the freezer real quick because they were starting to melt. Now I've got the last bit here with the dates and a big heaping spoonful of the cocoa in there. Let's blend this up. Okay guys, with the chocolate one, you're just gonna have to take my word for it. It's gotten a bit too melted right now, so it's not exactly like ice cream consistency anymore. It's almost a little too melted now. But yeah, it still would have come out good. It's just that I'm doing this for the purposes of the demonstration that you can make different flavors. Normally you would just pick one flavor and just go with that. But yeah, so anyway, I'll show you what the other ones came out looking like, and we'll still eat this, but it just doesn't look quite as nice. Alright guys, so there's the ice cream. The berry kind, the vanilla kind, and like I said, the chocolate one just got a little too runny. I'm going to turn it into a shake. With all of these, I'm fairly certain you could just put them back into some kind of container and freeze them for future, consumption. But I mean, who the heck's going to do that? You want to just dig in and eat this. So it's really great, really nutritious, really healthy, no added sugar. Just you can't beat this. It's a basically perfect treat for kids, for adults, everybody. So nothing not to like in this. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I just want to finish by saying that if anybody hasn't read Dr. Greger's book, How Not to Die, it's a very interesting read. I highly recommend it. He talks a lot about kind of his way of classifying different kinds of foods by like a light system. So he tells you that there are some foods that are red light foods, which you should avoid if possible and replace with healthier options. Yellow means like, you can get away with eating it in, limited amounts. Not the best. Usually things that are processed, even if they're plant-based, if they're really highly processed or refined, he will kind of put them into a yellow light category. And then the green light foods are the ones that he recommends just eating as much as you basically want. They're health promoting, and they're good for you. And if you read that book, you'll see that berries and fruits are green light foods. And again, I just want to go back to the best available evidence shows that at the very least you do have to watch how much dairy you consume, because it has an overall, at the very least, questionable effect on your health. The saturated fat intake, the cholesterol intake is definitely not good. There are other problems associated with it, as I said. You could take something as delicious as ice cream that everybody loves, and it has all these problems especially for people with lactose intolerance. But again, all these other health problems associated with it, you could take that food and turn it into a green light food by making it from bananas and berries. You can get actual health benefits. The more of that you eat, the healthier you're going to be. Whereas with the ice cream, I'm pretty sure nobody is going to argue that. So yeah, that's my final thought. I hope you enjoyed this video. I do realize it's a bit long, so appreciate it if you stuck with me till the end. Yeah, give it a big thumbs up if you liked it, and share it with your friends. Especially anybody who's sharing on social media on Februdairy, please do share this. I really appreciate that. So thanks again to everybody who's subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one.